Welcome to another episode of Photo Enthusiastic. I'm your host, Jim Fair. I'd like to revisit the Canon 60 Mark II today. Canon has relented on their 24p and put 24p back into the camera, which is nice. So, perhaps it's time to take another look at the camera now that it's been out for a little while and try and figure out who this camera is for. And the obvious answer would be people who had a 6D. Do you want to upgrade to this camera? Well, what's different about it? It has a tilty flippy screen. It's slightly more megapixels. And, at 26.2 to be precise. And it has 45 cross-point autofocus points in its optical viewfinder. Or you can use dual pixel CMOS AF in live view, like I'm doing right now for video. So supposedly this is tracking me, and it doesn't seem to be moving. It seems to be stuck, but maybe that's my settings. It's not the camera's fault. Anyhow, so this is not a review. I'm going to just say that right up front. Because people are always like, if this is a review, you need to use it for 6 months, day in and day out, and in the mud and everything else. It's like, yeah, I get it. And, I don't really get that in depth in my comments on these cameras. I'm just sort of trying to shed some light on who this camera might be for. So if you want into the Canon ecosystem and you want a DSLR and not a mirrorless camera, you could do worse than the 60 Mark II. In fact, I think I'm going to use this camera moving forward as my camera in the workplace, because I've been using the 5D Mark III, which is a little heavier and quite a bit older. And I think, maybe the image quality will have a little bit of a bump. So we'll see how that goes. Anyhow, I just wanted to reiterate the fact this thing does not do 4K. I think maybe there's a 4K time-lapse mode, but there's no 4K video in here. And why? Because I guess Canon is trying to protect its higher-end cameras. They have higher-end cameras to protect, unlike Nikon. So, when they come out with a camera, it's like the Z6, for example, it's got 4K. This is almost a hybrid camera. It's kind of a mirrorless and a DSLR merged into one camera, because you can use it in live view and get a lot of the advantages of mirrorless. Or you can just flip that screen back in and use the optical viewfinder when you're shooting stills. And, that kind of makes it a little bit unique. Plus, the tilty flippy screen is nice to have for vloggers, for example. Although, you tend to sort of look slightly off to the screen so you can see yourself instead of looking down the lens barrel to your audience, which is perhaps a little distracting for the audience. What does this camera have besides the usual features and 6.5 frames per second, dust and water resistant, built-in GPS? It's kind of nice to have GPS in there without having to buy some external gadget. Mind you, GPS does tend to be a bit of a battery killer. So, built-in GPS. But how often do you need that when you want to tag your cameras with GPS? And there's other ways to do that with your smartphone. It's got Wi-Fi, it's got near-field communication, it's got Bluetooth, and GPS. But I think the signature feature is the vari-angle touch screen, 3-inch touch LED. And the fact that it's a full-frame camera. So, and the price. So here in Canada at the moment, I believe it's $14.49 body only. If you want the ridiculously expensive 24-105 lens, it's almost another $1,000. But, you can get a prime lens, get yourself a 50 millimeter, and then you have a pretty decent kit. for starting out with Canon glass? Or should you look at the mirrorless side of Canon? So you've got the EOS R, which has come down in price to, I think, $23.99, so a mere $200 more than a Z6, and you got like, 32 megapixels, I think. Or the RP, which is only 1300. The body's less than the 6D Mark II. So what does the RP have over the 6D Mark II? Well, and it is a full mirrorless camera, but you've got to buy the more expensive new lenses on the new mount, or use the adapter. And at this point in time, I think Canon is throwing in the adapter. Like Nikon was doing that on the Z6. I think they're going to do that till Boxing Week, probably. I did notice that the Nikon D750 with the thrown in 50mm f1.8G lens went up $200. So instead of $15.99, it's $17.99. So I expect that will come down again Boxing Day or at some point. So if you're into the Nikon side of things. The D750 is, showing its age, and, maybe this is a D750 killer if you don't have a lot of glass and you just want to step into Canon. Pretty much any camera you buy is going to have decent image quality, and when you print things out, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. You could even use Micro Four Thirds, and you probably couldn't tell the difference until you're printing really large prints, I found Micro Four Thirds a little underwhelming, just in terms of the image quality, especially high ISO image quality just isn't there. I think that, I'm a bit of a full frame snob. I've said it before. So, I think if you want the best image quality, you're not going to use like your phone to take pictures. You're going to use either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, and ideally one that's full frame, with a lens system that you can grow into. So that really narrows it down to, Canon, Sony, Nikon, maybe Fujifilm. Well, Fujifilm, doesn't have full frame. They've got APS-C, or you can get their monster, medium format stuff, which is not cheap and rather heavy. So, I don't really... after my foray into Fujifilm, I enjoyed it. It's good stuff. There's nothing wrong with Fujifilm. But yeah, it's not full frame, and I can see the difference. For most purposes, you probably can't, but I'm not a big fan of the X-Trans sensor and the software issues you have trying to get the best quality out of that. So, if you're looking for a camera these days, half decent DSLR with a lens system you can grow into, I'd probably go mirrorless like a Z6 or a Canon RP or even EOS R on the Canon side. On the Sony side, I would wait. Unless you can afford the A9 Mark II that just came out. The A7 Mark III is obviously going to have a successor at some point. There'll be a Mark IV, I imagine. And will that put everyone else to shame? I have reservations about Sony's mount, which was designed for APS-C. So if you look into that mount, the IBIS mech doesn't have a lot of room because that circle, that hole in the camera for the mount is only, I believe, 49 millimeters, if memory serves. So it's not very big. Nikon's a full 55 millimeters. I think Canon is almost the same on their mirrorless mount. So this may give Canon and Nikon an advantage, and of course they already have an advantage in terms of ergonomics and perhaps color science over Sony. So, sorry Sony fans, go ahead and love your product, that's fine. I don't hate Sony or anything, I just don't think Sony is for me. And, I don't necessarily recommend them to anyone. I would rather get a Canon or a Nikon in most cases. But, The value proposition is compelling, especially if you look at the eye autofocus, and now it can eye autofocus on animals, which is fantastic if you're a wildlife shooter, you know. So anyway, the right tool for the right job, they say, and everyone's different. I think you should hold the camera in your hand before you buy it, and that's my advice. Thanks for watching. Fade out.